As for democracy, let me point out that when Colonel Mason of Virginia got up toward the end of the convention and he said, "This Constitution needs a Bill of Rights," that proposal was voted down unanimously without debate, with just the delegation from Massachusetts abstaining. So the Constitution was a rather undemocratic instrument. Well, if it was so blatantly elitist, how did it manage to win ratification? How did it win the popular vote? Well, in fact, the Constitution was never submitted to a popular vote. It was never ratified by the people. It was ratified in state conventions, and those conventions were controlled by generally men of substance or whatever else. And having said all this, let me add, though, that the Constitution was not without some real democratic concessions for its time. For instance, there was no property qualifications for federal office. Salaries were going to be paid to officials. This eliminated then the practice of public office being open only to the rich who could afford it. The president and all office holders were elected for limited terms. No one could claim a life tenure on any office except the Supreme Court justices and the other federal judges. There was no religious test required for qualification. That was a progressive and democratic step forward. By the way, that was a feature that's very different from in a number of state constitutions. There were explicit bans against Catholics, Jews, and non-believers from holding office. Bills of attainder were outlawed, and that is, you can't find someone guilty of an offense without benefit of a trial. And then eventually, the Congress was forced to pass the first 10 amendments. In fact, the only way they could guarantee getting the Constitution ratified, a number of states said, "We'll ratify it only if you pledge to put in a Bill of Rights." And that Bill of Rights had a whole bunch of excellent democratic things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, freedom to peaceably petition for redress of grievances, a separation of church and state. The Constitution also did something else. It guaranteed a republican form of government. Article 1, Section 9, no title of nobility shall be granted by the Constitution. In other words, it said this is an open system and all that, but you cannot go back to monarchy or aristocracy, which was a real concession because about 21 of the 55 delegates favored some form of monarchy. They couldn't come out and say it because of popular opposition, but about 21, almost half of the delegates, if they had their way, they would have had a king. So these men feared and loathed democracy, and yet on a number of occasions they found it necessary to show some regard for popular sentiment, as with the direct election of the lower house, as with putting in a republican form of government, and so forth. They understood that if the Constitution was going to be accepted by the states, and if it was going to have any stability, it had to gain some measure of popular acceptance. So they felt compelled to leave something for the people. So they were powerful. They dominated the events of 1787 to 1789, but they were far from omnipotent. The class system they sought to preserve was itself the cause of marked restlessness among the people, and this is the contradiction they're constantly dealing with. There still continue to be land seizures by the poor, food riots, and other violent disturbances throughout the 18th century. This popular ferment, by the way, spurred the framers in their effort to erect a strong central government, but it also set a limit on what they could do. What I'm saying is they didn't give us a Bill of Rights. They didn't give us these democratic things. These were won by the agitation of democratic forces in the society. These were concessions, including the Bill of Rights, which they reluctantly gave up. They had to make concessions, just the way management today reluctantly gives certain concessions or a contract to its workers because the workers are well organized enough, and this is the only way to get them back to work. So it was under the threat of democratic rebellion that they made these democratic concessions. They kept what they could, and they grudgingly relinquished what they felt they had to. And what I'm saying, the myth of the Founding Fathers, is that they were driven not by a love of democracy, but by a fear of it. Not by a love of the people, but by a prudent desire to avoid popular uprisings. The Constitution, then, was a product not only of class privilege, but of class struggle, a struggle that continues to this day. This is Michael Parenti talking some real history.
That was Michael Parenti with part 1 of a 4-part series on history, the myth of the Founding Fathers. Come back for the next program on TUC Radio, when Parenti will discuss the Spanish-American War and the rise of U.S. imperialism. Here's a brief preview from that lecture.
The Spanish-American War was fought between the U.S. and Spain in 1898. Now, well before that war, American business interests had been growing overseas and enjoying the protection of the U.S. Navy and Marines. But the war does mark a turning point in that process. That is, a turning point in the use of American military power to ensure economic expansion. In 1898, Cuba was still a Spanish colony. And by the way, there already was a war underway. It had been going on for years. It was a war between the Cuban insurgents, the Cuban National Liberation Forces, against the Spanish colonial army. Supposedly, Washington was at odds with Madrid because Spain was acting in a repressive way in Cuba. Indeed, Spain was acting in a repressive way. Concentration camps, mass arrests, killing people, trying to repress the insurgency. Well, these denunciations of Spanish cruelties increased in frequency as the U.S. decided it wanted to take over Spain's colonies. Well, a closer reading of history reveals that the U.S. leaders were more interested in national gain than in humanitarian rescue. That is, they were more interested in Cuba than in the Cubans.
Michael Parenti on the Spanish-American War, coming up on the next program. Michael Parenti is an internationally known author and lecturer. He's one of the nation's leading progressive political thinkers and has taught at colleges in the U.S. and abroad. His books include Democracy for the Few, Super Patriotism, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, The Terrorism Trap, and History as Mystery. You can find out more about real history on TUC Radio's website, www.tucradio.org. That's tucradio.org. Look under newest programs. You can get information how to order a copy of The Myth of the Founding Fathers that includes the lecture on the Spanish-American War by calling us. TUC Radio is free to all radio stations. Your tape or CD order is the only support we receive and is essential to keep us on the air. Call us toll-free anytime at 877-TUC-TAPE for information on how to order. You can get your tape or CD by mail or credit card, by phone, or on the web. Our toll-free phone number 877-TUC-TAPE translates into 1-877-882-8273. My name is Maria Gelarden. Thank you for listening. Give us a call.